We're in our third video, The Life of Lady Hope. We're going to go over her biography, The Evangelist to the Lost, and going a little more detail into her encounter with Charles Darwin at the end of his life, Darwin and Lady Hope. I love this picture here of Lady Hope witnessing to those men in the court, in the royal court. They're being exposed to a lot of people to share the gospel with. So this is a great picture painting by Claire Phillips. So let's begin. Elizabeth Reed Cotton. She was born in 1842 in Tasmania, which is south of Australia. She was brought up in the Christian faith, and both her parents were Presbyterian with missionary hearts. And they were traveling, of course, in Australia. They're English. She had a younger brother and sister, but both of them died of whooping cough one in 1856, where her sister died, and her brother in 1859. So going through that grieving process, at first she seemed discouraged, but then she turned her life over to the Lord Jesus Christ, knowing that she'd see both of her siblings in heaven. And she started sharing the gospel and speaking publicly as a young teenage girl. Elizabeth Cotton. Her dad was Sir Arthur Cotton, very famous. You could look him up and you'll find a lot about him. He was a famous engineer. He spent 40 years in India working on giant irrigation projects on the Godavari River in India. And this saved literally millions of lives there in India. There is even a statue to his service there. A great man whose works have conferred untold benefits to the people of India. In fact, he was considered one of the greatest engineering geniuses the world has ever known, and captain of the Royal Engineers, and even knighted by Queen Victoria. That's why his name's Sir Arthur Cotton. He was knighted for all of his. He was a light, basically a light to India. You'll find. And so, of course, Elizabeth would be famous, being the daughter of one of the famous engineers of that time. Elizabeth speaks and travels with her father. In 1854, she's traveling to England at the age of 12 at that time. And on the ship, many people became sick and they were dying of smallpox. And so she helped care for them and prayed for them. She was sharing the gospel and praying for those to open their hearts to God, and praying for those that were dying and those that were sick, and praying for miracles. And that's when her evangelism started blossoming in the midst of trouble. And after the death of her siblings, she dedicated her life, as I said, to sharing the gospel. She was only 14. Her father then allowed her to give Bible studies on his travels and to share the gospel wherever he went, and she traveled with her father. And he had many speaking engagements. The friends of the Cottons. So the friends of her family. Dr. David Livingstone became a family friend and encouraged her as missions, encouraged her to be a missionary. Dr. Livingstone, do you know who he is? He was basically that missionary that in the dark parts of Africa that opened Africa up to the gospel. So have you ever heard the saying, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? You know, Stanley and Livingstone, very famous. Well, this was one of the men that had encouraged, friend of their families that had encouraged her. Wilbron Taylor's daughter became her best friend, and she became a great hymn writer and missionary, and they were close friends in sharing the gospel. In 1861, at the age of 19, she traveled to a public banquet they were giving for her father in London. There were 200 distinguished people there. And her father was honored for his brilliant achievements. And Elizabeth was by his side, shared the gospel at every opportunity, and got to know all of these famous people. And they all were aware of her vibrant love for Jesus. So she was well known. Moving to Ireland, they moved to Sheffield, Ireland in County Down. Friends of her family were Earl Roden and Robert Jocelyn, and they started a haven for missionaries and the evangelicals right there, and she was involved with them all. Elizabeth became involved with many missionaries and encouraged them, and she became a close friend of Catherine Marsh, who opened a hospital for the poor. A picture of Catherine. Catherine, again, a very famous missionary, a very famous lady, and she knew Elizabeth, and again was a close friend of hers. There's a picture of Mrs. Marsh. You can look her up. Ministering to the scientists of the day. In 1866, Elizabeth was 24, and she continued her travels with her father as he spoke as an engineer and naturalist. He was the Star of India. That was actually what they considered his name, Star of India, and was asked to speak at many scholastic venues. The Geographic Society invited him to speak and share of the engineering feat in India too. Elizabeth met many of the scientists and naturalists of that time, including she met Charles Darwin then, and when she was only 24. She was known for her freshness and her love for the poor and for the sharing of the gospel. Here's a picture of some of the famous scientists and naturalists of that time. So she, again, very well known. Dorking, England was 20 miles south of London, where she settled in there. Dorking's population was 5,400, but it was growing very quickly. Elizabeth began her philanthropic work founded in the gospel of Jesus Christ, which would last the rest of her life. So she was out there ministering to the poor. Her father financially supported her to start classes for girls who were interested in sharing the gospel to the poor children. So she'd come in as an evangelist and share them how to give the gospel and how to share with the young people and the children of that area. And so these young women, girls and young women, would come to be encouraged and discipled by her. And the boys wanted to come to her Bible studies too, so she started a class, and she called her class the Class for Wild Boys, who were uncared for and untaught. And she'd bring them in and help them and feed them and clothe them and bring them into the gospel message, her Class for Wild Boys. So the class for girls, young girls, and the class for wild boys, and class to teach those evangelists. Here you have some picture of some wild boys coming to the Lord and sharing the gospel. Can you imagine? Our coffee rooms. Have you ever heard of coffee houses in London? Well, their coffee rooms were for spreading the gospel. Christian coffee houses. Even before Christian coffee houses were thought of, during the Jesus movement here in America, Elizabeth and her father had organized these coffee houses in London and in England. Her father rented a room for men to attend because he wanted to draw them away from alcohol, because they were definitely, in the temperance movement, they were against the men. So many men were drunks in that time, and getting them clean and free so that they could come someplace safe. And he called these rooms the coffee rooms. Many young men were coming to the city to work, not knowing anyone. And so these coffee rooms would feed them, and they were free of charge while they listened to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth would read the Bible and share the gospel and pray for them. And she held prayer meetings each day for those who needed prayer. So every day she'd have prayer meetings, and as some of the men would come in, and some women too, she would share the gospel and pray. Written testimony. She wrote their testimonies. There were many testimonies of God's miracles in the coffee rooms, and she recorded them and wrote them down in her journals. William Dinage, a young man, wrote of the coffee room, and this is beautiful. He said, Miss Cotton conducted services at 8 a.m. on Sunday for non-church goers. She drew large audiences and was very popular. She had a pleasing and engaging manner and a silvery voice. Her message was simple, all about Jesus. Doesn't that give you goosebumps that she was sharing all about Jesus? He said her message was simple, So many came to know the Lord through the coffee houses and Elizabeth giving the gospel. Elizabeth's writing in 1876, she published Our Coffee Room, about the coffee rooms, which was so charismatic and charming, and all the beautiful things that had gone. And she gave these little publishings, like they would come out like once a month, like little journals coming out to share what was going on in the coffee room. That another famous person, wasn't so famous at the time, but her name was Florence Nightingale. So do you know Florence Nightingale? I'm sure you probably do, because she was the one starting the first nursing school for nurses. Well, she was so impressed with Elizabeth's writings of the coffee house that she copied her writings and gave them out to the soldiers in the Crimean War. So as Florence Nightingale would go and care for the soldiers, she'd give the gospel and read to them Elizabeth's writings of Our Coffee House. Florence Nightingale became a close friend of Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, of course, wrote many testimonies and books, and all were focused on Jesus Christ. So now she has another famous friend that would become even more famous as she started nursing. Basically the School of Nursing. That's what Florence Nightingale's known of. I'm sure you know her. The temperance movement. Elizabeth saw the devastation of alcohol on people's lives in the slums of London. And her parents did not advocate drinking in their work and mission, so she was not for alcohol. And she was convinced of a total absence of alcohol. She helped many through the horrors of addiction. Her coffee rooms were safe havens for many recovering alcoholics. Here's a picture here praying for, and how alcohol had caused many families to go into poverty, and she was getting them out of poverty and off alcohol. She was criticized, of course, for her stand against alcohol, even though it was that movement of the temperance movement. She said, basically, they would say, "Would you really deprive working men of a beer?" And that's what her enemies would say. And she even received death threats, but she had no fear. In fact, one time she said, "I am not intimidated easily by the hooligans that might be bribed by the brewers and publicans." She felt that the bribes were coming into these hooligans. They were paying them to come in and try to destroy her coffee houses. And they were paid by the brewers and the publicans. And one time a robber with a gun came in and said, "If you scream, I'll blow your brains out." And she said, "Sir, I am not the sort of woman to scream." And then she furthered with the gospel and led him to Jesus. Quite a testimony. The working men honored Elizabeth. Elizabeth would not avoid sharing Jesus with men. When she visited the hospital, she'd share with the wounded soldiers at the time of the Crimean War, and she would touch their hand and tell them about Jesus, and she would pray with them. And she would say, "You know, now is the accepted time. Today is the day of salvation. Would you like to pray and receive Jesus?" She would definitely say that as evangelist. Many times she would kneel down and pray with needy men, even in her sitting rooms. She was greatly admired, and many gave her gifts. One time, a group of workmen came to the hall with a set of silver candlesticks. They had all together put in their funds and bought for her a gift for Christmas. She was so thankful, and almost in tears as they came, and then she had them all singing hymns all through the evening and praising Jesus. That's the kind of person Elizabeth was. Christmas was especially beautiful, and she served many for Christmas, and many came to know Jesus as their Savior. Her marriage now to Admiral James Hope. December 6, 1877, at the age of 36, she married Admiral Hope in Dorking near London. He was from a very distinguished naval family. You can look him up and you'll find him in Wikipedia. Anyway, he was the commander of the battleship at Trafalgar, And that was a famous battle in the Napoleonic Wars, which established the British naval as supreme for over 100 years. So this guy was, the Admiral Hope was famous, and he was a hero. He served in the Crimean War against the Russian Tsar with the HMS Majestic, and he was severely wounded on 2 occasions. He even was the naval aide to Queen Victoria, and he too was knighted, Sir James Hope. Very famous man. And so he had been a widower. He basically had lost his wife for many years, and so he was older than she was, and they got married. New Hope of Caradon, that was her name, and that was Lady Hope. The Admiral was a devout Christian, and he was a temperance advocate. He did not drink alcohol, and Elizabeth loved him deeply, and he loved her. Although their age difference was 22 years, she was 36 and he was 68, he helped Elizabeth establish many coffee rooms and to spread the gospel. He loved to have her spread the gospel. Now she would have a new name, as many now called her, what? Lady Hope. Remember? Elizabeth Cotton? Now she definitely was called Lady Hope. Lady Hope attracted large crowds. She was most heartily received and known now as Lady Hope because she was married to a knight. And if you had married a knight, you were considered a lady, knights and ladies. And she had married Hope, Admiral Hope. So now she was called Lady Hope. But everyone called her Lady Hope for another reason, because she shared the hope of Jesus Christ. So Lady Hope became a valid new name for her now that she was married to Admiral Hope. So let's stop there and we'll continue in a little bit.